Welcome to Misunderstood Minds. I'm your host, Wendy Moore, and today we're going to talk about grief. But maybe not grief in the way it's usually talked about, because for many people, grief doesn't unfold in stages. It doesn't move in order, and it rarely behaves in the neat ways people often expect. In fact, one of the most common things grieving people say is, "I thought I'd be further along by now." And there can be so much quiet shame in that, as though grief has a timeline, as though loss should move predictably, as though healing means eventually to no longer feeling the ache. But grief is much more complex than that, and much more human. Many people were introduced to grief through the ideas of stages. So denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And while that model helps normalize some experiences, it was never meant to suggest grief moves neatly in sequence. Yet many people absorbed it that way. And when grief doesn't behave accordingly, they think something is wrong. Someone may say, "I thought I had already accepted it." Then months later, something small brought it all back. But grief returning is not failure. It is grief being grief. Because grief moves in waves, not lines. Sometimes gentle, sometimes overwhelming, sometimes absent for weeks, until suddenly present again. That is not regression. That is how attachment loss often works. Grief is not simply sadness. It is the nervous system adapting to absence. And that is very different, because grief is not only emotion, it is reorganization of identity, of expectation, of attachment, of meaning. And grief can emerge after many forms of loss: death, divorce, illness, estrangement, trauma, lost futures. Sometimes even losses people have never fully named. It wasn't just losing them, it was losing who I was with them. That too is grief, and often a very deep grief. One reason people struggle with grief is that we often speak as though grief is one experience, but there are many griefs. The grief most people recognize, loss through death, yet even here, sudden loss, anticipated loss, traumatic loss, all shape grief differently. Sometimes someone is still here, but the relationship as you knew it is gone. Through dementia, addiction, estrangement, mental illness, that is grief too. They were still alive, but I had already begun grieving them. That is ambiguous grief, and often one of the loneliest griefs. Losses society often minimizes: miscarriage, pet loss, breakups, infertility, role loss. Losses people often grieve silently. I felt ashamed how devastated I was after losing my dog. But grief does not measure legitimacy by social approval. Attachment determines grief. There is one form of grief I want to name specifically, because it is often deeply felt and frequently minimized, and that is grief after losing a companion animal. Pet grief can be profound, because for many people, these relationships are not peripheral. They are attachment relationships. Sometimes primary attachment relationships, sources of comfort, co-regulation, routine, companionship, unconditional presence. And when that bond is lost, the grief can be enormous. So someone might say, "I felt embarrassed how devastated I was when my dog died. Like people expected me to just move on." And yet, for that person, that may have been the safest relationship in their life, or the steadiest, or the most constant. Of course, the grief is significant. Companion animals often hold unique roles. They may have accompanied people through trauma recovery, loneliness, illness, grief after another loss, major life transitions. Sometimes they were present through seasons no one else fully witnessed. That matters. My dog was there through my divorce, through depression, through everything. Losing him felt like losing home. That is grief, real grief. Sometimes pet grief carries added layers. Guilt around euthanasia, wondering, did I wait too long? Did I act too soon? And that can complicate mourning. There can also be grief in losing daily ritual, the walk, the greeting at the door, the silent companionship. Often people underestimate how much the nervous system was organized around those rhythms until they're gone. And pet grief can carry echoes too. Sometimes people continue hearing tags jingle, expecting paws in the hallway, looking toward the door. That is attachment searching, just as with other grief. Love does not distinguish sharply between human attachment and animal attachment, and grief often doesn't either, because attachment echoes are attachment echoes. If you have grieved a companion animal deeply, there is nothing excessive about that grief. It reflects love and attachment and loss, which is what grief has always reflected. And sometimes pet grief also carries identity grief, because losing a companion animal can alter daily life, routine, and even who we feel ourselves to be. And again, grief becomes layered. Sometimes grief is mourning the life you thought you'd have, a future, a self, a childhood never received. I realized I wasn't grieving one event, I was grieving what I never got. That can be profound grief. Sometimes grief begins before the loss arrives, and people feel guilty for that. But often, the psyche is preparing. The brain stores attachment through repetition, the daily patterns, voices, presence, routines. And when someone is gone, the nervous system still expects them. I still reach for my phone to call them. That is attachment memory. And sometimes that memory returns in waves, not because grief is unfinished, but because attachment echoes. This is where grief and neural echo loops meet. Sometimes grief returns because emotional echoes are reactivated through dates, songs, smells, places, anniversaries. Grief often returns not because healing has failed, but because echoes are being awakened. Every November, it comes back. That is not setback. That is memory linked to meaning. Sometimes grief does not soften, not because someone is grieving wrong, but because something in the loss remains unresolved. That is often where complicated or prolonged grief can emerge, especially when grief carries shock, trauma, guilt, unfinished conflict. It still feels like it happened yesterday. Sometimes that grief frozen inside trauma. Not simply mourning, but grief carrying shock, and that needs tenderness, not judgment. Sometimes present grief awakens older grief, old ruptures, old longing, old absences, and suddenly one loss feels impossibly large because it is touching many losses. I thought I was grieving the breakup, but something much older was hurting too. Sometimes grief is not only about who was lost, but what was never securely held. That matters deeply. And grief is not only emotional, It is physical. People often feel grief as a tight chest, fatigue, restlessness, aching, emptiness, searching. And sometimes they don't recognize it as grief. I thought something was medically wrong. It was grief. After loss, the brain often keeps searching, listening, expecting, orienting toward the absent person. I kept expecting to hear their car in the driveway. That is attachment still searching, profoundly human. Sometimes grief lives not only in memory, but in the body's echo of attachment. There's something else rarely talked about enough. Anger and grief. Anger at the loss, at fate, at illness, at what was taken, at what was unfinished. And many people feel guilty for that anger. But anger can be part of love meeting helplessness. It does not make grief less loving. Often it means grief is moving. Older grief models emphasize letting go, but often healthy grief is not about letting go. It is learning how the bonds continues differently. Memory, ritual, inner relationship, love changing form. I still talk to them, and somehow that happens. That can be healing. Maybe grief does not ask us to move through stages. Maybe grief asks us to learn how love, loss, memory, and attachment continue living in us. And perhaps that is why grief comes in waves, because love echoes. This is Misunderstood Minds, where we make sense of what never quite made sense before. Misunderstood minds deserve careful listening, not quick conclusions. And as always, understanding begins with curiosity.